Spawn is one of the most powerful characters in comics. He survives hell. He carries impossible weight. He keeps going long after anyone else would break. And he perfectly embodies the burnout we all feel. Because burnout doesn't happen when you quit. It happens when you refuse to. When productivity turns into sacrifice. When doing it for them quietly costs the people you love. I learned that the hard way. When something I built to create a better future started hurting the people who depended on me. So what if burnout isn't failure at all? What if it's loyalty to the wrong version of yourself? This is Disassembled Heroes and Villains, and this is the story of the burnt-out hellspawn, Simmons. Burnout doesn't begin with collapse. It begins with a choice that feels reasonable, responsible even. A moment where staying feels easier than stopping, where just a little longer sounds like commitment, not danger. To understand why burnout traps capable people so effectively, we have to look at the decision that starts it. Because burnout doesn't come from bad intentions. It comes from a deal that made sense at the time. Simmons doesn't sell his soul because he's greedy. He doesn't do it for power, or dominance, or ego. He does it for love, for purpose, for the chance to fix something he believes never should have broken in the first place. And that's what makes him so dangerous, not as a monster, but as a mirror. Because this isn't a reckless decision, it's a rational one. Al is a soldier, a professional, someone who has survived by being capable, disciplined, and effective. So when he's offered a deal, just one more chance, he treats it the way he's treated every hard mission before. Something he can endure, something he can manage, something he can survive. He believes the cost is temporary, that he'll suffer now so things can be right later, and that logic is familiar. Because burnout always begins this way, not with self-destruction, but with responsibility. With the belief that if you give enough, sacrifice enough, endure enough, you can earn your way back to what matters. I just need a little more time, just long enough to fix this. I can carry it. Al doesn't think he's losing himself. He thinks he's buying time. But here's the truth burnout never announces up front. Every deal built on sacrifice assumes you'll recognize the moment it stops working, and most people don't. Because the deal rewards you at first. It gives you purpose. It gives you identity. It gives you the reassurance that the pain means something. Spawn doesn't immediately look like a mistake. For a while, the deal works. He's powerful, necessary, important, but it's a trap. Because once suffering starts producing results, it becomes very hard to question it. Burnout doesn't start when you're feeling overwhelmed. It starts when you convince yourself the cost is proof you're doing the right thing, that the deal made sense. And it's the exact same deal almost everyone who burns out makes willingly. The problem with a deal built on sacrifice is that it assumes the world will wait for you, that the people you're doing this for will still be there unchanged when the suffering finally pays off. But life doesn't pause out of respect, it adapts. And that's where burnout takes shape. When Simmons returns, the pain isn't what he expects. It isn't hell, it isn't the chains, it isn't the scars. It's what he left behind. Wanda didn't betray him. She didn't abandon him. She didn't replace him. She moved on. She rebuilt a life in his absence, not out of malice, but out of necessity. And that distinction matters, because the most painful part of burnout isn't being replaced. It's realizing no one needed to replace you at all. And that realization is devastating for people who believe their sacrifice was holding everything together. Because suddenly, the question isn't, why did they move on? It's, if they didn't need me, what was I destroying myself for? Spawn doesn't just lose his old life. He loses the reason for the deal with Malboja, the idea that the suffering was protecting something fragile, the belief that everything would fall apart without him, but it didn't. And that realization creates a specific kind of grief, not for what you lost, but for what never depended on you the way you thought it did. This is the same space that modern burnout takes up, and jobs that keep running after you leave, and businesses that survive your absence, and families that adjust when you're not fully present, because you didn't matter, but because life is resilient. And that realization is so painful when you've tied your worth to being indispensable to something that never asked for your life. Spawn doesn't rage because Wanda moved on. He breaks because the story he told himself, I endured this so they wouldn't have to, never fully true. The world didn't need his suffering, and that realization is more painful than any monster that could be thrown at him. Because if your sacrifice wasn't holding everything together, then staying longer wasn't noble, it was unnecessary. And once that truth sets in, you're left with a terrifying question. If the world can survive without me, why am I still destroying myself for it? When that truth settles in, most people don't stop. They don't rest, they don't grieve, they don't ask whether the sacrifice was ever necessary. They double down. Because if the world didn't need your suffering, then the only way to justify it is to keep going long enough that it finally means something. Spawn's life and afterlife doesn't collapse because he's weak. It collapses because he's capable. When Al Simmons returns as Spawn, he doesn't come back powerless. He comes back with the full strength of a Hellspawn. He can fight armies, he can survive things that should end him, and for a while, that power makes it look like the deal worked. But those gifts don't solve the problem. They overshadow it, because strength doesn't always free you. Sometimes, it delays the one thing you actually need to face. Spawn uses his power the same way burned out people use competence, to keep moving, to stay useful, to avoid sitting still long enough for the weight to catch up. Every fight becomes a distraction. Every victory becomes another excuse not to stop. But nothing he does brings Wanda back. Nothing fixes the time he lost. Nothing restores the life he thought he was preserving. The power just makes it easier to avoid the truth. And somewhere in the background, a buried voice keeps whispering, if I keep pushing, this will all get better. Spawn's chains are the perfect metaphor. They're weapons, they're tools, they're extensions of his will, but they're also restraints. The same thing that lets him reach farther binds him tighter to the role he can't let go of. It's the same thing that happens when work becomes identity, when you're the one who can handle it, the one who always shows up, the one who doesn't break. Everything starts depending on you, and dependency starts to feel like meaning, until it doesn't. I remember a moment like that in my own life, running my comic shop. On paper, I had done what I said I would do. I had built something from nothing. I had taken on responsibility. People told me how impressed they were that I could manage it all. And yet, when the noise died down, I didn't feel relief. I felt trapped. Not exhausted, trapped. That was the moment I realized that pushing hadn't healed anything. It had just given me a bigger shovel to dig myself deeper into burnout. Spawn learns this the hard way. His power doesn't restore what he lost. He just makes him better at surviving without it. And survival isn't the same as belonging. Burnout isn't exhaustion. Exhaustion is physical. Burnout is emotional. Burnout is postponed mourning for a life that used to feel simpler, lighter, human. It's what happens when you're too capable to collapse, but too afraid to stop. When the world keeps asking more of you because you've proven you can take it, and you keep saying yes, because stopping feels like failure. Spawn keeps fighting not because it's working, but because stopping would mean admitting the deal didn't save him. Everything he touches becomes a trap. Power delays the reckoning, capability builds the cell, and the longer you stay inside it, the harder it is to remember why you entered in the first place. That's the moment where burnout truly begins. But here's the part that makes it so hard to escape. Because once you've proven you can survive this way, once you've shown that you can carry more than anyone else, the world doesn't tell you to stop. It rewards you. It hands you responsibility and calls it trust. It hands you obligation and calls it purpose. And eventually, you start telling yourself the same thing. That if you step back, everything collapses. That if you slow down, you're letting people down. That this weight is proof that you matter. That lie is what keeps Spawn trapped. And it's the same lie that keeps us burning out long after the work stopped meaning anything at all. There is a lie that burnout feeds on. It doesn't sound dramatic. It doesn't feel selfish. It usually sounds responsible. If I stop, everything falls apart. Spawn lives inside that lie, and after the deal, after the power, after the loss, there's a moment where stopping becomes unthinkable. Not because the fight still matters, but because he's convinced the consequences of stepping back would be worse than the cost of continuing. So he keeps going. Not because it heals him, not because it restores what he lost, but because the role has fused to his identity, just as K7 Letha is fused to Al Simmons. He isn't just doing the work anymore, he is the work. It's the moment where burnout becomes truly dangerous, because when responsibility replaces identity, stopping doesn't feel like rest, it feels like emptiness. This is where so many people get stuck. You don't say, I'm exhausted. You say, I can't stop. You don't ask, is this worth it? You ask, what happens if I'm not here? It's not dedication, it's fear. Spawn makes this literal. K7 Letha doesn't just protect him, it feeds on him. It empowers him while draining him. If he uses it too much, it could kill him. If he uses it too little, innocent people suffer. So every choice feels justified. Every sacrifice feels necessary. And slowly, the original reason, the love, the meaning, the purpose fades into the background. All that is left is obligation. This is the burnout lie. That responsibility is the same thing as meaning. That being needed is the same thing as being valued. That carrying more weight proves you matter. But here's the truth Spawn never gets told early enough. Responsibility without meaning isn't noble, it's corrosive. Burnout isn't what happens when you care too little. It's what happens when you care long after the reason has expired. When the mission continues, but the why is gone. When you're no longer choosing the burden, you're just afraid of who you'd be without it. That's why burnout doesn't arrive with a crash. It arrives quietly. You stop asking for help. You stop imagining alternatives. You stop resting because you don't need it, but because rest feels undeserved. And the world reinforces it. People praise your resilience. They admire your work ethic. They thank you for holding it all together. No one asks what it's costing you. Spawn becomes terrifying not because he's powerful, but because he mistakes suffering for purpose. He confuses penance with meaning, and once that happens, the role never ends. Because if everything depends on you, then stopping feels like betrayal, but it isn't. It's the lie. And until you name it, burnout doesn't just exhaust you, it owns you. Before we go any further, if you ever stayed inside a role longer than you should have, if you ever confused being needed with being whole, if you've ever wondered whether letting go meant you failed, then you're exactly where you're supposed to be. This is Disassembled Heroes and Villains, not a show about power fantasies, not a highlight reel of victories, but a place to slow down and examine the characters we grew up admiring, and ask what their sacrifice costs. Because heroes aren't defined by what they can endure, they're defined by what they choose to carry and when they finally put it down. Over the course of this year, we're following one question across stories, worlds, and myths. What kind of person are you becoming when no one is forcing your hand? We'll explore that tension through figures like Optimus Primal, Spawn, Captain America, and the Doomslayer, and others who discover that doing the right thing often feels like loss before it feels like meaning. So if this question matters to you, if you're trying to build a life that doesn't consume you in the process, subscribe. You're not late, you're not behind, you're right on time. At some point, the story has to turn, not with triumph, not with redemption, but with honesty. Spawn doesn't begin to change when he becomes stronger. He changes when he realizes that surviving isn't the same as living. For a long time, Simmons treats failure as proof that he has to keep going, that stopping would mean the sacrifice meant nothing, that if he lets go, what remains of his former life disappears. But this isn't what failure is doing here. Failure isn't erasing the past, it's clarifying it. Spawn didn't fail because he cared too much. He failed because he expected caring to save him, and that distinction matters. Because burnout teaches us the same lie, that if something costs you enough, it must be worth it, that pain validates purpose, that exhaustion is evidence of meaning, but eventually, reality pushes back. The power stops working, the sacrifice stops paying dividends, the role you built your identity around stops giving anything back. And that moment feels like collapse, but it isn't, it's a signal. In Spawn's story, that signal arrives through mentors like Cagliostro, not saviors, not miracle fixes, just reminders that power is a resource, not an identity. The suit doesn't disappear, the responsibility doesn't vanish, but Spawn learns something critical. If you don't master the thing you rely on, it will consume you. That's the real lesson of failure. Failure doesn't mean the sacrifice was wasted, it means it taught you what it couldn't give you. It tells you, this role can't be your whole life, the burden can't be your entire meaning, this version of you is necessary, but it isn't permanent. And that's where Spawn diverges from the characters we focused on in last week's episode, Optimus Primal of the Transformers. Primal teaches us to carry weight with integrity. Spawn teaches us when carrying it longer would destroy us. Letting go doesn't erase what you built, it integrates it. The skills stay, the growth stays, even the scars stay. What leaves is the illusion that you have to keep bleeding to matter. Stopping isn't quitting your life, it's choosing not to sacrifice yourself to a role that has already taken enough. Failure isn't the end of the story. It's the moment the story finally tells you the truth, and if you listen to it, if you let it speak without shame, it doesn't condemn you. It redirects your attention to the life you were trying to protect in the first place. So if burnout isn't weakness, if it isn't laziness or failure or lack of grit, then we need a different question. Not, why can't I handle this anymore, but why am I still here? Because once failure stops being something to outrun, it becomes something you can listen to. And that brings us to the real truth Spawn leaves behind between panels. about demons, not about power, but about burnout and what it's actually asking of you. Burnout isn't laziness. Burnout isn't weakness. And it isn't a sign that you didn't want something badly enough. Burnout is what happens when you stay inside a role long after the reason that gave it meaning has expired. Spawn teaches us that lesson the hard way. Simmons doesn't break because he lacks strength. He breaks because strength keeps him from stopping, because capability convinces him he's still obligated, because power delays the moment he has to be honest. That's the danger of being responsible for so much. Burnout isn't the absence of effort. It's the refusal to ask whether the effort is still aligned with who you're becoming. When everything depends on you, honesty feels dangerous. When people rely on you, rest feels irresponsible. When your identity is fused to the role, letting go feels like erasure. But Spawn shows us something critical. You don't heal burnout by becoming stronger. You heal it by becoming honest. Honest about what the role is costing you. Honest about what it no longer gives back. Honest about the difference between responsibility and identity. Letting go doesn't mean the past was a mistake. It means the past did its job. The skills remain, the growth remains, even the scars remain. What leaves is the lie that you have to keep suffering to justify who you've been. Burnout isn't asking you to disappear, it's asking you to integrate, to take what the role gave you and stop letting it define everything you are. Spawn doesn't find peace by winning, he finds it by refusing to let the suit decide his worth. That's the truth behind Spawn. Not that you should quit everything, not that the sacrifice is meaningless, but that staying, after the reason has ended, will eventually cost you the very life you were trying to protect. Burnout isn't your enemy, it's your signal that it's time to start telling yourself the truth. Burnout leaves behind a very specific fear. Not the fear of working hard, not the fear of sacrifice, but the fear that if you stop, everything you endured will mean nothing. That the years you gave, the energy you spent, the parts of yourself you burned away, will vanish the moment you let go. Spawn lives inside that fear, because he's weak, because he lacks resolve, but because admitting the fight is over feels more terrifying than continue to suffer. Simmons doesn't fail because he cared too much. He fails because he didn't know when caring had turned into self-destruction. That's the part most people miss. Burnout doesn't come from loving the wrong thing. It comes from refusing to admit that love has changed, that the role that once gave you meaning has started taking more than it gives, that staying loyal to who you were is quietly costing who you're becoming. Spawn keeps fighting because stopping feels like loss, like betrayal, like admitting the deal didn't save him. But here's the truth his story slowly reveals. Putting the shovel down doesn't erase the hole, it just stops it from getting deeper. Failure doesn't undo the sacrifice, but it explains it. It shows you what the season could teach you and what it never could. You don't lose the skills you built, you don't lose the strength you earned, you don't even lose the scars. What you lose is the lie that you have to keep bleeding to justify having lived. Spawn doesn't find peace by going back. He can't. He finds it by finally accepting that survival alone was never the goal, that life didn't end just because one version of him did, and that's the sobering hope buried inside his story. Burnout isn't the proof that you failed, it's proof that you stayed long enough for the truth to catch up with you. So if you're tired, not just physically, but existentially, if you're afraid that stopping means the past was wasted, or that letting go means you were wrong, you're not broken, you're listening, and that matters. So I'll leave you with this question Spawn's story asks quietly. What are you still carrying because you're afraid to admit that chapter is over? Not because you're lazy, not because you quit, but because you finally outgrown the role that once made sense. If that question stayed with you, if it unsettled something or clarified something, I'd really like to hear it. What part of this episode hit closest to home and why? Drop a comment, let's keep this conversation going. And if you want more episodes like this, where we don't just analyze heroes and monsters, but use their stories to understand ourselves, make sure you're following Disassembled Heroes and Villains. So stay thoughtful, stay honest, and as always, stay handsome.